Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Hello.
Do you want a mic?
Comrades.
That was a unique start. Good afternoon. Welcome to the final event in what has been a terrific semester colloquium on health and human rights. And today's topic, as you know, is nutrition, gender, and food security in Africa. This is the 5th out of 10 weeks, I guess. We've been meeting every other week. Some of you have been here all along, especially the students who are getting credit for it. There are many familiar faces, and I know a lot of people have been here at most of them. I just want to thank our co-sponsors, so the Graduate School, the Hogg Foundation for Mental Health, the Dell Medical School, and the St. David's Center for Health Promotion and Disease Prevention Research in Underserved Populations in the School of Nursing. And I just messed up your PowerPoint. There we go. So we could not have done it without them. Also, just for those of you who haven't been here, the way that things will work is first of all, Steve Sonnenberg, who's been co-teaching the colloquium with me, will introduce Raj Patel, who is our main speaker, and Snehal Shingavi, who is the respondent. I think Raj will speak for 30 minutes or so, 30 to 40 minutes, and we'll have about a 10-minute response. And then the nice thing is we have a lot of time for questions and answers. So the students in the class get the first shot at them, and you all are a little dispersed. No, you're right there. So Raj, they're at these two tables. We've read a fair amount of Raj's work, and they've written papers, and so it's a chance to engage with him on that as well. So, but we'll have conversation which everybody should be able to ask any question they want. I now introduce Steve Sonnenberg, or recognize Steve Sonnenberg. I recognize you.
Thank you for recognizing me. So she said I have 30 seconds, but now that I'm here. First of all, Snehal was asked to participate in this because he is a faculty fellow at the Rapoport Center, and also because of some specific interests of his in theories of nation and Marxism. I'm particularly interested in getting to know him because one of my Plan 2 thesis advisees is writing about Abraham Lincoln's theology and psychology during the American Civil War, and we've been studying Gandhi, so now I have a source of somebody who really knows a lot about Gandhi, so I'll be contacting you. Now, I want to say something about Raj Patel. I just got back from 2.5 weeks of field work in Vietnam and Cambodia. Some people misunderstood and thought it was a vacation. It was not a vacation. One of the things that I learned, though I've been studying the Vietnam War ever since the Vietnam era when I was on active duty, not in combat, but I am a Vietnam era veteran, and I've studied the war ever since and taught it. And because I had been reading Raj's work before I went, I realized that probably the greater destruction of Vietnam was not the military. It was the NGOs and other American government officials who went into the country with the best of intentions, destroyed the agrarian tradition, and along with it, the traditions of Buddhism, Taoism, ancestor worship, and a real connection to the soil. And we left Vietnam with a rather plastic idea of American entrepreneurship. Now, I want to tell you something about Raj's last name. It is Patel. It is a name that is associated with Gujarat province in India, and according to my research, it actually is connected to the soil. Patel is related linguistically to the word for soil, to the word for farmer. Now, because I am a psychoanalyst, and also because I do have some interest in what Raj has termed his atheist Hindu beliefs, I'm very interested in the way multiple generations affect us in our thinking. And my hypothesis is that Raj, who is a remarkable scholar and a remarkable public intellectual and a remarkable activist, look him up on Google. I don't need to tell you all the wonderful things he does. But I think it's in his bones. I think it's in generation after generation of connections to the soil. Now, I tell all of you students that I want you to write and think from your guts and from your hearts as well as your brains. My hypothesis is that Raj can do none other than that. He must speak and write and work from his guts and his heart, as well as his really good brain. And I hope he conveys that to you and inspires you, and that you students will embody that in your final papers. And on that note, Raj, please.
What can I say? Thank you very much. I hope to inject some truthiness into the discussion today by speaking from my gut and my bone. So now, but really what I want to do is talk to you. I want to talk to you about this, a big plan to feed the world. And this plan, I'm sorry. Thank you all for being here. And I just get very excited. Also, I'm running on fumes at the moment for various reasons. So if I jump around a little bit more than usual, you'll need to forgive me. But I do get quite excited about this plan to feed the world. Troubles me, and I hope it will trouble you. The reason it's troubling is because, well, you remember in 2007, 2008, there was the global food price crisis. And we were told that there were 1 billion people going hungry, although those numbers have since been revised downward through a magical bit of statistical recalibration by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and we can talk about that in a second if you like. But things look pretty grim. And a number of countries promised any amount of philanthropy and food aid to solve the problem of global hunger. But the really big money, the really big numbers of when it comes to sort of fighting hunger, were only really released in 2012 under the presidency of the when the US had the presidency of the Group of Eight, the G8 countries, the world's largest exporting economies. And those countries met in 2012 in the United States, and then in 2013, when Britain had the presidency of the G8, they met here. It's a very interesting place. This is a Bridewell Palace here, and then this is the Unilever building, palace, headquarters. No, what's very interesting about this is this happened at a summit. It was called the British Hunger Summit, but its specific name was Fighting Hunger with Business and Science. This Fighting Hunger and Business Science conference began, and it was really set here in Bridewell Palace. The head of Unilever, Jan Polman, comes up to the stand after the conference begins with a very boring presentation by Ban Ki-moon, in which he's not allowed to move any muscle in his face, and he stares at the video camera and he just refuses to. I mean, basically, he moves his lips kind of, but he says, "I wish you well." For 20 minutes, he wishes people well, and then comes this thing at Bridewell Palace where Jan Polman comes up and he says, "Well, here we are in Bridewell Palace." And we Unilever have manufactured so many things that are good for health, like Flora margarine, with full of trans fats and everything. We'll skip over that. So they said, well, here we are in Bridewell Palace. And Bridewell Palace used to be one of Henry VIII's palaces. He used it as a place where he went to shag his mistresses, and then it just became a fun house, and then it became a prison and a debtor's prison and a brothel, and now it's Unilever. And I think he meant it to sort of signify a break between the past and the present, though in many ways it remains a place where people get shagged. Because what was interesting about it is, so he says, look, here we are, and we're going to business and science, we're going to beat hunger together. And then there are two people, Frank and Mwajuma, are brought up to the stage. And I've written to the secretariat for this conference and a few other people trying to find out what Frank and Mwajuma's names were officially. Frank and Mwajuma's never given second names, but they were young people from Tanzania who testified about the horrors of malnutrition, and they've lived through malnutrition, and their parents were malnourished. Their parents left to find work, and they were sent off with their grandparents, and their grandparents were able to take care of them, and so Frank and Mwajuma, both independently, were malnourished. And they ended their testimony with a call for the Group of 8 countries to end malnutrition. And after that, David Cameron, the Prime Minister, bounded up to the stage, and he said, "Yes, Frank and Mwajuma, it's a tragedy, and it's not just bad for Frank and Mwajuma, but it's bad for their economies." And he then reeled off a set of statistics along the lines of, did you know that malnutrition costs the world $3.2 trillion every year? Did you know that the average malnourished person loses 20% to 30% of their salary over a lifetime because of their malnutrition? Because stunting has real and irreversible effects. The first 1,000 days of life are incredibly important, and after that, there are changes in the body that are fixed to the extent that you can trace out over the course of a lifetime how economically damaging that can be. So he makes this case, and then he ends with, and so we, the British government, because we have a history of being really nice to people, and he has this sort of thing about, that's just the right thing to do, being British. We're just good people. Colonialism. Good, we're good people. And so and he commits hundreds of millions of dollars. Now the largest part of the British aid budget goes to something called the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. And so it's important to say, well, so what is this fabulous thing that's going to, what's the alliance? I mean, food security and nutrition, these sound like fantastic things. We must have more of them. What is it that these things are? When the New Alliance was launched, it was launched in the United States as a public-private partnership under the Obama administration. The sort of front man was a guy called Raj Shah, who is the administrator for the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. And so when he was sort of talking about the New Alliance, what he said was, look, what we need is public-private partnerships. We are never going to end hunger in Africa without private investment. There are things that only companies can do, like building silos for storage and developing seeds and fertilizers. So what's interesting about that is it's wrong. That's a lie, actually. Because if you think about the history of agricultural development in the 20th century, when you think about the Green Revolution, who was it that built the silos for storage? Who was it that developed the seed and developed the fertilizer? It wasn't the private sector. It was foundations and the public sector. Specifically, when you think about the Green Revolution, you think about Norman Borlaug working away in Mexico. He wasn't part of a corporation. He left DuPont to do that. He wasn't, and when you think about the silos, the vast amount of silos in that time were public grain storage facilities. So to be able to talk about fertilizers and silos and seeds without, and doing it without possibly imagining the private sector to be involved is historically wrong. So then you've got to ask, well, why is he saying that? And the answer, it seems to me, is that he's not being historically accurate, he's being politically accurate. It's not possible in the 21st century to think about doing this without thinking about the private sector. And incidentally, students, I'm going to have a go at you a little later on, but it's very interesting that in a lot of the students' response to this paper, students found it hard to think about doing things without the private sector. And I think that Raj Shah finds it hard to think about doing things without the private sector, even though historically that's kind of the way things have been done, and there's no really good reason why we should imagine the private sector integrally involved in this. It's hard to think about it otherwise. And this is kind of Exhibit A. I mean, it's hard for anyone in the United States now to think about doing things without involving the private sector. And it's important to understand why it is we're unable to imagine away the private sector or imagine a different role for the private sector. But it's also important to note that in making the justification for this new alliance where the private sector and the public sector need to be together, this is a justification. Historically, it's inaccurate, but it becomes a sort of a testament. So what is the New Alliance? Well, the New Alliance it has a focused goal. What it wants to do is lift 50 million people from poverty by 2020. Now, of course, this is important because if you're interested in ending food security and malnutrition, it is absolutely important to understand that food security and malnutrition are about poverty. poverty is the big problem here. And the way that the New Alliance wants to do this is by mobilizing private capital, taking innovation to scale, and managing risk. Now, this all seems a bit vague. So let's see. What does that mean? There was an interesting kind of amicus brief by the German Marshall Fund, and they put out a sort of covering analysis of the New Alliance, and it looked like this. In their economic policy paper series of 2013, they said, the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition, pushing the frontier of enlightened capitalism. And I think that's interesting, right? I mean, the idea is that capitalism heretofore hasn't been terribly enlightened, and yet it might be. And so that's the promise of the New Alliance, is that capitalism might not only be in it for itself, but that there may be moments where capitalism and helping people out of hunger might go hand in hand. We don't know, but it could be. And this is the frontier right here. Though oddly, the New Alliance is also built on a series of other relationships and agreements in Africa, including one called the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. People heard of AGRA, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa? It was set up by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's headed now by Kofi Annan. And the idea is that a few African leaders decided that they wanted the kind of green revolution that they heard had worked so well in India and elsewhere. Ignoring the data in India around what the green revolution has cost and the fact that India still has more hungry people than the entirety of Africa, despite having been the epicenter of the green revolution. The mystique of the green revolution is still very powerful. So they wanted a green revolution in Africa. And of course, the history of the Green Revolution is a history of subsidies, of population control, of marketing and extension, occasionally, seeds and fertilizer. But the seeds and fertilizer weren't as important as making sure that farmers had a place to sell their product. All of this, of course, has been thrown out of the window, and the way that the people remember the Green Revolution in the 20th century, now, the way we think about the Green Revolution is, well, it was Norman Borlaug working very hard to grow these miracle wheat and miracle rice, and there was fertilizer and pesticide, and everything was great. In fact, the majority of the Green Revolution was about making sure that there was social and public sector infrastructure for all of the Green Revolution to happen. Point being that when you look at the kinds of things that this partnership is going to build on, it looks a little different. I mean, this is a report about DFID, the Department for International Development, the British version of the USAID. So this is the international aid agency, or the aid arm of the British government. And as the report notes, there are these sort of agro dealers, these people who sell seed and fertilizer. In the past, it used to be the sort of public sector extension services that made these things available to some extent. But now, of course, all of it has been privatized. And as it says here, Monsanto's country manager in Malawi admitted that all of Monsanto's sales are coming through this agro-dealer network. So Monsanto's doing quite well out of these networks of investment in ending hunger in Africa and providing the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. And this is kind of what we might expect from the New Alliance. But don't take it from me. Take it from the New Alliance itself. You won't be able to read this, but there are three things that the Malawian government has to do in order to comply with the New Alliance, right? The alliance partners will be put into place, and there'll be money to make it happen. But the Malawian government has three jobs, and there are only three criteria by which it will be judged to have succeeded or not succeeded, complied or not complied with the New Alliance. And so the three things it has to do is, number one, improved score on doing business index among the top 100 economies. The second thing is increased dollar value of private sector investment in the agriculture sector, value-added agro-processing. And the third thing is increased private investment in commercial production, sale of inputs and produce, and value addition. So this sounds a little weird. I mean, you may think, well, we started talking about hunger, but this seems to be about businesses. This seems to be all about the private sector. It doesn't really seem to be about a partnership so much as a capitulation. And certainly that was one of the criticisms that circulated at the time that the New Alliance was announced. And so, very interestingly, an NGO called One, you may have heard of them advertised by Bono and Jeffrey Sachs occasionally, interchangeably. One came up with this very interesting graph, and they said, no, this isn't about foreign countries marching into Africa. Well, it is a little bit, Because when you see these sums of money, and of course these are out of date now. The Norwegian company Yara, but this is the world's largest fertilizer company, providing most of the money from Norway, and they've committed now nearer $3 billion to this enterprise. Switzerland has Syngenta, and then we have various things in the United States. But one was keen to draw our attention to this bar over here, which proves that it's not just about foreign companies, but African companies too are interested in the new alliance. And I think it's interesting to take the Tanzanian example. Unfortunately, that turned out to be Swedish capital located in Tanzania. So this was actually Swedish money laundered through a Tanzanian front company. But there are still, let's take that out, but still, we've got this and a couple of those. And I think it's very interesting to not just to read this as a kind of imperial foreign companies marching into Africa, because there is an African middle class. It's very small, but they are interested in this new configuration of power and what it might allow them to do within their country. So there are lots of domestic Malawian companies that are interested in having foreign investment or committing to this partnership and having the way smoothed for them. I mean, for example, this press agriculture one is very interesting because what they want to do is make available, they want to expand seed production, and they want to do that on 50,000 hectares. Now, seed production is, it requires good quality land, and in order for them to get good quality land, they need to have land from somewhere. Now, the thing about good quality land is people generally know where it is, and they generally tend to farm on it. And so, one of the stories we heard when they were there, and next time I'm back, I'm going to be going down to verify, is that there was a village headman whose land was on the border, was riverfront property, so there was good access to water. And he, in the hunger season, the period of the year, where you're just before harvest and you've run down your stocks, the hunger season was pretty bad last year, and people went to the village headman asking for food, and he, instead of giving them food, he gave them cash, which was unusual, but was welcome, and so people went out and bought food with it, and then they discovered that the cash was actually payment for them to move away from their land, so their land could be bought by a foreign multinational. Now, this idea of land grabs in Africa is, it's something that is actually pretty of a piece with this new alliance, because making these resources available is what the new alliance is interested in doing. I mean, that's one of the commitments that the government makes by joining the new alliance. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is very keen on this. In their documents, they talk about land mobility, which is Bill and Melinda Gates speak for where the land stays where it is, but the people who are on the land are made mobile, so that so that more efficient use of the land can be made. So you have your foreign and your domestic multinational. The reason I wanted to mention this is just because often in these stories it's Malawians are all good and everyone outside of Malawi is very bad. But this is a complex story. This is a story that involves a local bourgeoisie. It is a story that involves people who want to make their way in the world. A story of people who see opportunities in this new alliance and opportunities to be able to make money and create jobs, and perhaps then to be able to give people jobs who will then be able to be lifted out of poverty, and therefore hunger and nutrition will be ended. So this isn't just a sort of good guy, bad guy story. It's a very complex and interlocking kind of story in which, in which Malawians, for example, are allowed to be corruptible. In fact, they have to be corruptible. The story of the Malawian government after all this is that the president, Joyce Banda, was deposed. Well, not deposed. She was elected out of office because of a huge scandal called Cashgate, in which most, the 20% of government funding sort of seems to have disappeared, but most of it went to services paid for to agencies friendly to the government, but for services were never delivered. So it's possible for there to be bad people in government in Malawi, just as it's possible for there to be sort of people rubbing their hands with glee outside Malawi at the prospect of this new alliance. So I just want to set that up, because the interesting question, and one that I'm going to speed along now, because I think this is the interesting question, is, look, I've just been talking about business for half an hour, and the problem is that we haven't really talked about why this is the new alliance for food security and nutrition. What's the nutritionness of this? Well, there are two things that appeared in the document associated with this that I think are important. One is this: salt the New Alliance suggests that what needs to happen is that salt be fortified with iodine. Now, this is a terrific idea. No one disputes that having iodine-fortified salt helps to reduce some of the diseases that accompany iodine deprivation. Trouble is, of course, to be able to buy salt, you need a job and you need money, and this isn't terribly helpful if you remain cripplingly poor. Similarly, there isn't really a good picture of maternity leave. This is the best thing I could find on Flickr. But point being, the maternity leave is an important part of what the government has promised to do, to increase maternity leave from 6 weeks to some unspecified number. Which is, I mean, it's better than the maternity leave we get in the United States if that ends up happening, and I think that's a tremendous idea. But bear in mind that this only affects 2.5% of the female population. Now, this isn't to say that 2.5% of the female population ought not to be given maternity leave. Of course they should. And, of course, we need maternity leave if we're interested in fighting malnutrition. The thing is that if you are in formal employment, the chances of you're being malnourished and your children being malnourished are far less than if you are in the informal sector and if you're a subsistence farmer where the majority of poverty is. Now, this isn't to say, again, just to be clear, that I'm against maternity leave, because I'm not. I think maternity leave is a good thing, let it be known. But it's weird that these are the two sort of policies, iodine fortification on salt and this maternity leave thing. And again, it betrays the fact that this is a policy geared more towards middle class Malawians than it is towards the Malawians who are going to be suffering malnutrition. But it's interesting that it fits into this larger story of a word. There's a term, nutritionism. Have people read Michael Pollan use this term? So Michael Pollan, people have heard of Michael Pollan. Okay, if you haven't heard of Michael Pollan is a food writer for the New York Times, among other places. He's written widely on the global food, on the US food system. One of the terms he uses is nutritionism, and it comes from a guy called Georgi Skrinis, who talks about nutrition as this reductive focus on the nutrient composition of food as the means for understanding its healthfulness, as well as a reductive interpretation of the role of these nutrients in bodily health. And he writes about it in a book called Nutritionism, which I recommend. Now, nutritionism doesn't come from nowhere. It's an idea that's historically, of course, been about technologies of control. I mean, the idea of vitamins and adding vitamins to food has a lot to do with military preparedness in the United States and in the United Kingdom. But there's a very interesting moment, and since we're in a centre that's about human rights, I wanted to sort of talk about a moment in which human rights considerations about hunger gets trumped by other kinds of considerations. And that moment happens just when you expect it would, which is around the end of the Cold War and the beginning of this sort of period of the heyday of neoliberalism in the United States. And it happens, it is reported on by the Hawaiian academic Aya Hirata Kimura. And she talks about this very interesting moment when the World Bank starts to worry about hunger. And, you know, the Berlin Wall is down, the Soviet Union's collapsed, it's just a sort of smoking pile over which Jeffrey Sachs is, providing his consulting services. And there's a moment where it's obvious to the United States, and particularly to the sort of generation of economists in the World Bank, that what they have to do is end hunger, and they get to have this clean slate of ending hunger, and they adopt the kinds of ideas that circulated at the time, which is, well, we must have public-private partnerships, we must work together with bring the public and the private together, and we're going to end hunger, and they start writing this very interesting document about nutrition and nutrients, and they publish it in 1994, and they have these kinds of quotes where. The name of the document is called Enriching Lives, and they say things like, deficiencies of just vitamin A, iodine, and iron could waste as much as 5% of gross domestic product, but addressing them comprehensively and sustainably would cost less than 0.3% of GDP. Now, I just want to point out how weird that is. Because when we're talking about addressing hunger, historically, and this may be a generational thing, I don't know, but when I was growing up, saying something like that would be considered callous.
Yeah.
saying something like that would be considered just beyond the pale, because the main reason hunger is bad is not because it is a sacrifice of gross domestic product, or even just an unwise use of gross domestic. It's not even just bad economics. The reason hunger is bad is because it is a violation of the right to hunger. It's an insult to someone's dignity. Now, what happens historically in this moment is that those kinds of concerns are being assaulted by an economism, an approach of thinking about the world that is not about it's not incompatible with, of course it's unjust, also it's bad economics. But this is a kind of dog whistle, because this isn't addressing us as human beings sitting around here saying, well, of course hunger is bad and it is a violation of the right to food that so many people go hungry in the world. This is a dog whistle for the business community, because what emerges around about the same time is the Business Alliance for Food and Fortification, headed by these three companies, Coke, Danone, and Unilever. And they respond to the World Bank's document with one of their own, where they take forward the idea of fortification in food. And they say, well, actually, we're ready to help because companies already own the right technology to make a difference, as well as the distribution channels and communications networks. So I think this is interesting because businesses hear this is a bad, governments are ready to make investments in order to be able to increase returns on investments in nutrition. And companies here, well, of course, give your money to us, and because basically what we can do is add vitamins to our stuff, and then we can sell it. And we already have the technology to do that, and we already have the marketing to be able to reach people. Win, win, win. Now, the logical extension of this, if this seems like, oh, well, this is all very abstract, do people here remember Diet Coke Plus? Diet Coke Plus, if you weren't, it sort of flashed up in the aisles and then was laughed away. But for a very brief while, you in the United States, you could have Diet Coke Plus, which is your regular sort of Diet Coke plus added vitamins and minerals, so that you could drink your chemistry set and lead a healthy and fulfilled life and still have 0 calories. Now that was the sort of the business response to this call for increased nutrients in food. It's not a let's transform poverty, but it's more, hey, wait, we can help with this communications and with this fortification thing. We can do that. And that's what's very interesting about this historic moment at the end of the beginning of the 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, where there is a transformation in the way that hunger and nutrition is understood. So, sorry, that date should be 1995, not 2005. So, this brings us back to the end This brings us back to the Hunger Summit, because it seems to me that there's an interesting question. What are Frank and Wajuma? That's Frank and Wajuma there. What are Frank and Wajuma doing at the Hunger Summit? They're there to testify about their hunger, but they're not there really to give any ideas about how to tackle it. Their job is to be bodies on a stage. Their role at this Hunger Summit was a kind of habeas corpus, right? Their bodies have to be shown on stage so that then other people can come in and save the day. There's an epistemology, there's a way of knowing and understanding the problems of hunger, where you present the body and then action will happen as a result of that. The king will decide what it is that needs to be done. But there's no... their brains, their thinking, their ideas, their politics, their rights matter not at all. It's just their suffering that then is appealed, is used as the basis of an appeal, and then there will be transformation that happens as a result. They will become the bodies into which money is invested. And in fact, the other sponsors of this fighting hunger with business and science, the other sponsors of this summit were called the Children's Investment Fund, which again, 20 years ago would have been considered, the subject of a Monty Python joke. We're investing in children. Well, in fact, it is the subject of a Monty Python joke. I'm just remembering. Do you remember the Monty Python joke about where a nice man comes into the tax office, into the merchant banker's office, and said, "I'm here to collect money for children," and is it a tax dodge? And he goes, no, it's just for the children. Well, you're making no sense to me. Get out. And of course, a lever is pulled and the man disappears through the floor. But essentially now children are a tax dodge. And next time I do this presentation, I'm going to use that clip because it's brilliant. Anyway, point being, we're now entering an era in which Frank and Wajuma's poverty really is off the table. What we need to do is just fix their bodies so that they are able to survive this poverty. This is the era of poverty with added vitamins. Now, I'm going on way too long, but I'd really love to be able to show this film clip of the other... Can I... Okay, so I don't want to leave on a downer. So what I'd like to do is just sort of counterpose this with an alternative, which emerges from Malawi also at the end of the 1990s, when hunger is rife, where the HIV/AIDS epidemic is rampant, and life expectancy is 48 years old, where 50% of children are malnourished. Some nurses and some activists in a pediatric malnutrition unit decide that they want to end hunger. And they decide they want to do that by essentially by growing better crops. And so they figured out ways of increasing crop production. They intercrop. They become farmer scientists. Because the agricultural extension services that would normally teach farmers how to do all this, all of that's been defunded. There's very little money to do this. So farmers themselves become scientists. And you have 5,000 farmers becoming experimenters in a sort of peer-to-peer network of farming and agricultural research. And so they get seeds, and they learn about Native American crop planting. So you have the three sisters of corn, of squash, and of beans. So you plant the corn because you want the corn is the staple food in Malawi, and then squash is fantastic. It also shades out weeds, and then the beans fix nitrogen in the soil and helps improve soil quality. And I've seen better three sisters planting in Malawi than I've seen in some parts of Mexico. It's an amazing series of interventions where people figure out what works. So they've been doing that, and they basically get together and have these sort of farmer scientists days, and so they work on their crop diversification. But they also, and I guess some of you will know the answer to this already, but those of you who don't, there is this problem that they were doing so well. They had as much corn as before, and they outperform industrial agriculture with this agroecological technique. But they also, and they have 40% more protein. But they have a problem, which is that you have all this food and child or infant malnutrition remains high. So how is it that you can have more food and infant malnutrition remains high? Not going to the right people? No, because this is for domestic consumption. Yes, breastfeeding. So the problem is that you have harvesting is women's work. And harvesting is women's work, but so is carrying water and fetching firewood and cooking and breastfeeding. And so when there's more harvesting to do because there's more food, then and you still have to fetch firewood and cook and carry water, then the breastfeeding can go down. So the farmers themselves come up with this idea of, initially they say, we're going to teach the men to cook by going door to door with the Food Network style, and with a chef, and they knock on the door and they'll be like, hello, man of the house, come out here. You may have seen your wife hunched over this. It's a pot. And then the man would be like, oh yeah, I've often wondered how that worked. And so there'd be a cooking lesson, and then it'd be like, bye bye, see, you've changed my life forever. And of course, nothing would change. Because just like the Food Network, it was a sort of moment of entertainment. It wasn't about transformation. So instead what they do is come up with these things called recipe days, where people do it together, where women and men and kids are part of a community of social change. And these moments become prefigurative communities. They become spaces where there is equality. And that equality is enjoyed in the moment that it exists. And women can call out men on our shit, but also mothers-in-law get to be called out by daughters-in-law around bad breastfeeding practices, and you end up with an amazing series of interventions that then are followed by hard feminist organizing door to door. And we have some data around the extent to which families do well under this, and we're expanding the data set to be able to really make some rigorous claims around this. But there's been an amazing amount that's come out of this peer-to-peer science network, where people are not, where the experts are not the people in London who want to fight with business and science, but when the farmers themselves get to figure out solutions, have experts available. I mean, there's nothing anti-scientific about this. They want to know what kind of crops grow well with other crops and where to. You'll see in a clip that I'll just show you, soybeans. Soybeans don't come from anywhere near Malawi, but people are using them, are excited by them, and are sharing varieties. But point being, this is a series of interventions where people don't always get the right answers, but they iterate and they get to make mistakes. It's just like the Wendell Berry sort of exhortation of be like a fox, make many tracks, some in the wrong direction. Practice resurrection, and that's what this the idea here is. The community is actually figuring out its path, but it's much more in control of its destiny than it would be certainly under the New Alliance. And they use peer-to-peer knowledge, mechanisms to share knowledge. They confront patriarchy, and that's very important because if you're interested in ending hunger, you need to know that 60% of people going hungry in the world today are women or girls. And they share these new feeding practices, and they use this essentially as a platform for politics and for transformation. So let me show you what that looks like. This is a clip from a documentary I'm working on with director Steve James. You may know his other work. He did Hoop Dreams and The Interrupters, and most recently a film called Life Itself. But here is a short clip of what these recipe days look like and the organizing around them. So that's the, if you want uplift, then you shouldn't be watching a Steve James film. But also, I think what's interesting is that this year we've gone back several years, and Jennifer's actually doing very well. Winston is it would appear incorrigible, and so she's just going alone. What Recipe Days offer isn't couples therapy; it's women's empowerment. And I think that's tremendously important because the idea here is that it is through women's empowerment that you find the kinds of results that you see here. I'm running way too late to walk through some of this. But basically the idea here is that you're seeing here improvements in mean weight for age Z-scores, so objective measures of malnutrition that you would struggle to find in any other single intervention that you might find in terms of fighting malnutrition. You won't get this by adding vitamins to anything. This is the kind of intervention that revolves around women's empowerment and therefore the ending of poverty, the increasing of household welfare, the increased amount of time for breastfeeding, but also a range of other political changes that come from these recipe days. And we can talk about those in the discussion. But I do want to address just a few problems because folk have raised, and I'm really grateful for the student papers, by the way, because it's really surfaced for me some of the areas where I need to strengthen this argument. Because some have said, well, what I'm doing is advocating the expulsion of billions of dollars of charity and philanthropy in the fight against malnutrition here. And I'm not really, see, the thing with philanthropy is it's the opposite of democracy. Philanthropy is what Bill Gates decides to do. And I've got a problem with that, and I think you should too, because although God, this campus is so crappy. I have to say, trying to find the law school is impossible. Just as trying to find the public affairs school, it's always named after someone who gave a ton of cash, right? I was telling Billy that if you want, what the map of this campus is good for is figuring out which families to hit up for cash as you walk around Austin. But it's not actually good for finding your way around campus. But it's a reminder that we've built into our everyday lives the idea that what we need to be doing is supplicating to rich families to be able to get shit done, and that's not okay. What's not okay is the idea that we don't have public funds to be able to build a good university campus. Instead, we must go to this rich person or this rich person or this rich. So, in a sense, philosophically, I'm fine with billions of dollars of philanthropic cash to be kicked out of Africa. But the other thing I'm fine with is debt repayment. I'm fine for us in the global North to be repaying the debt that we owe the global South. We shouldn't be thinking about philanthropy for Africa. We need to be thinking about reparations. So already to be falling into this idea of, well, poor Africa, what do they do without our money, is already to have gotten this ass backwards. Because what we really need to be thinking is, what the hell are we doing sitting on top of the tantalum in your cell phone coming from Africa, and do you know how much suffering that involves? We need to be paying back to Africa rather than be thinking about, well, what will they do without our cash? The second thing is, a lot of people worry, well, so how are you going to make this big? At least Coke has scale, they're everywhere. And these people have just 5,000 farmers, I've admitted as much. But in fact, what's interesting about this is two things. One, it's spreading from northern Malawi down south because it has been so successful. I mean, some of this data is nearly 10 years old, and it's already on the march further down south. And it is successful because, of course, the pediatric malnutrition unit has closed down for want of new cases from this area. Show me that kind of response and that kind of efficacy with the new Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition. But the other thing is, of course, what's interesting is you can scale this. And it is being scaled. What's interesting about this model is that you have agroecology and peer-to-peer networks where you have farmers learning from each other and you have gender rights becoming front and center. Well, there's an organization that's already been scaling this for 10 years. La Via Campesina has 200 million members around the world of farmers and farm workers who are already in the process of building this out. Show me that kind of return when the new alliance wants to get 50 million people out of poverty by 2020. This is going much faster and much bigger. So again, I push back on that idea of scale. Some people say, well, this doesn't address the needs of the 5.5 million women in Malawi, but the 500,000 women who are in formal employment. Yes, I'm down with that. I think yes, we need women's rights for everyone, not just for the rich, but for everyone. And finally, there's this idea about privileging the sort of boots on, the dusty, authentic agrarian alternative as opposed to the new technocratic alternative. And again, I want to dispute that. I mean, there's nothing traditional about women fighting patriarchy in this agrarian context. I mean, there's something very 21st century about it. There's nothing kind of, this is how they always used to do it and we must go back to that past because it was so awesome. I mean, the thing that absolutely, when you want to think about a brave agrarian future that you don't want to replicate from the past, is patriarchy. And here we have examples of women organizing, using feminist organizing to be able to overcome that. And I think that there's nothing sort of authentically rural or agrarian about that necessarily. And technocracy is, again, something that's a problem. I'm not sure we should be celebrating the idea that, boffins in Redmond, Washington, or wherever it is, the people with the geniuses behind the seed should be allowed to run agriculture policy in Africa. I think maybe people closer to Africa should be doing that. Maybe Africans. Maybe people who are democratically connected to a constituency where they're not afraid of technology. Again, hybrid soy seeds, you saw them there. People aren't afraid of those things, but people want to control them. And I think that it's the cracy and technocracy that I find a problem. I mean, technology is great, but technocracy seems to me the opposite of democracy, and I have a problem with that as well. And finally, yes, people are excited about the private sector. And I want to end with something that isn't about the New Alliance, but brings the New Alliance home to us here. I mean, if we're interested in, the role of the private sector in making America healthier, making the world healthier, I just want to show you this graph from the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. For those who would want to put their faith in the private sector, this is high comedy. The American Journal of Preventive Medicine is not a gag fest. But what it shows is basically there's this thing called the Healthy Weight Commitment Foundation that in 2010 announced that it was going to sell 1.5 trillion calories less because the Nestle and Danone and Coke and Pepsi, the head of the Healthy Weight Commitment Foundation is the head of Pepsi as well, interim. They said yes, we recognise that maybe there are too many calories being sold in the United States, and so what we're going to do is sell fewer of them. And it was announced earlier on this year in a report that the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation published that in fact they hadn't just sold 1.5 trillion calories, there's 6.4 trillion calories less they had sold. It's like 4 towers of Empire State Building size cups of Coke. Or if you prefer a different metaphor, it's like 3/4 of an Empire State Building made of lard. They sold that many fewer calories, and so there was confetti and free Pepsi. But what's interesting is, so this graph is very interesting because what it shows is, here's the trend line. Here's the trajectory that Pepsi, that in this case soda sales and packaged good beverage calories were on. And then here's what was actually sold by the Healthy Weight Commitment Foundation. And what this suggests is that actually it's better for the private sector to do nothing than it is, because this is the trend line had they done nothing. And here's what they actually ended up doing. And I think what this graph for me sort of points to is the sort of contradiction between asking for-profit enterprises to tackle an issue that's about poverty, exploitation, and inequality. And this isn't to say the private sector has absolutely no role to play. It's just that that role needs to be democratically circumscribed. And unless we are happy to regulate and limit the power of corporations to exploit people, then I'm afraid we're not going to be able to make claims about rights that are not about property rights. And what we're interested in, it seems to me, particularly in a centre that's interested in human rights, is something beyond property rights. We need to be thinking about the right to food and the right to, the right to water. And those kinds of rights, it seems to me, may not be compatible with the private sector. And insofar as they are not, the private sector must give, not the rights. Thanks very much. And sorry for going long, but Snehal, I guess you're up.
Cool. That's impossible to follow. I don't sound like Eddie Izzard the way that Raj does. He does it really well. And he's funny, and I might be a little bit of a downer, so that's, I don't know. I'll try. That was really exciting, and largely because I think that Raj and I come from a very similar place of wanting to combat some of the most egregious effects of neoliberalism on the planet today and trying to do in both our academic and our activist work some kind of critical thinking about the consequences of what neoliberalism has meant for the overwhelming majority of people on the planet. My current research is actually on slums in India and about the ways that poverty is talked about in India, but also how solutions to poverty in India are imagined. And what struck me while listening to Raj's paper is how similar kinds of, I guess, nutritionism adjacent ideologies are put forward when you try to think about poverty reduction. So the solution du jour for poverty in South Asia is actually this thing called microcredit or microenterprises, and the kind of ways that microcredit and microenterprises have been pushed as a solution to lifting lots and lots of people out of poverty by injecting small amounts of capital and giving people some control over money and credit that they didn't have access to, has been a very interesting way that these public-private partnerships have crept into even something like poverty reduction. So you have the kind of ridiculously weird oxymoron of capitalism trying to solve the problems that capitalism created. The sort of ways that we imagine or think through the questions of poverty, very interesting. It's also stuff in the sort of economics literature has been critiqued in the ways that we think about development and growth, and why the kind of chasing after development and growth doesn't always, actually never yields poverty reduction in the rates that we're seeking. But I wanted to begin in a sort of historical point because I think that part of the place where Raj and I may disagree a little, or maybe we can be in productive conversation about this, is that I deal mostly with urban poverty, and Raj seems to be looking a lot at rural poverty, and the kinds of solutions that are appropriate for rural poor and rural hunger will be very different. I mean, if you can imagine slum dwellers attempting something like the food production in Dharavi in Bombay, for instance, it's a harder thing to imagine exactly what that would look like. But I wanted to start with the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution is a really important historical thing to get your head around when you think about historically, not just historically what this does for food production, which is it increases pretty substantially in the 70s and 80s food production in places which aren't producing enough food for their own populations. But what it doesn't do is actually solve poverty. So in the injection of technical inputs into agricultural production in the 70s and 80s in India meant things like loans for tractors, pesticides, seeds, and the production of roads and storage facilities to allow that grain and or whatever else they were making to come to market. Such kinds of massive capital investments in agriculture had the twin effect of both increasing agricultural production, but also displacing and putting out of work millions of people who were agricultural workers or small farmers. So big agribusiness buys up the land, it pushes people off the land, those people then move to the cities and populate slums. This, in case you want the sort of more elegant version of the story, is told by Mike Davis in Planet of the Slums, which came out a few years back. It's a very interesting thing to sort of think through. But part of the reason that that happens is because of these food crises. So in one sense, we can think of historically, the Green Revolution was an attempt to manage food shortages. India was going through one of these in the 80s, and so more investments of this kind happened in India. In the 80s, we produced a problem in India of massive hunger moving from the villages and moving then into the city. So I think that this is all really interesting to think through in context, the language that we have about development, and why we chase after development, why development is given a suffering poor face as opposed to what development usually is, which is the rich getting absolutely filthy richer, or why microcredit has been promoted as a solution for poverty, because we know that in the era of neoliberalism, the state is made completely ineffectual at resolving questions of long-term and systemic poverty. Microcredit is seen as a kind of panacea, even though we know from most case studies that most microenterprises, something like 70 to 80% of them, are failures, because this is the nature of capitalism. Competition drives people out of business, and the products that are made go unsold. Most microenterprises are failure, but perversely, and this is where I think we should think through the question of women's empowerment very, very specifically, microcredit has been, especially folks who have read stuff about Muhammad Yunus and the Grameen Bank know that microcredit is normally promoted as a way to improve women's empowerment. It is usually credit given to women. It is usually credit given to small banks in villages run by women, and women make the decisions about how money should be parceled out. In Bangladesh, it has had the perverse effect of increasing the amount of domestic violence against women as men beat their wives for control over money that is not going into smaller households. So we should really think through the question of women's empowerment and what kinds of work that does to get our support for certain kinds of policies. And the reason I raise that is not because I think that the story that is being told in the video isn't a great story. It's a fantastic story. But we should also ask why it is that the narrative around women's empowerment is actually about labor extraction, right? So everything that is being asked of people is work harder, do more. You have to make more possible by thinking of yourselves now as either egalitarian or a harder worker doing the work that the state is not willing to do. So it is a kind of narrative about the extraction of more labor to make the land more productive. And there are, I imagine, social consequences to that are worth us also parsing out and thinking through. The second point that I'd like to make is about like how we think about poverty. And I think that there has been really good new work, and Raj's work is, of course, a part of this, about multidimensional thinking about poverty. So in India, perversely, poverty was reduced in a 5-year span, literally by changing the definition of poverty. So poverty went from being somebody who consumes, who lives on $2 a day or less, to somebody who lives on $1.50 a day or less. And you lower the poverty rate, and immediately you've solved the problem of poverty. I think nutritionism is a similar kind of thing. You change the kind of bundle of ingredients that you need to consume on a daily basis, and you've solved the problem of nutrition and hunger. Multidimensional poverty is a very interesting thing to think about in this sense, because it's not simply access to money, but also education, electricity, sanitation, housing, food, the whole lot of it. And lots of really interesting, I think, new work is being done to think through what a full package of multidimensional poverty solutions would look like, which also force us to think through the question of what poverty really means. And this, I think, will lead into the last 2 points that I kind of want to make, which have to do with whether or not it's possible to imagine solutions to hunger while capitalism still exists. Because where Raj begins is probably the place that we ought to think about the problems for the folks in Malawi. If the plan of the new alliance is actually to engineer state-sponsored sanctioned land grabs, which will allow new investments to take place for more productive, intensive, capital-driven agriculture to happen, how is it possible to imagine a small village doing this kind of work to make the soil more productive, to make it more fertile, et cetera, will not be within the targets of what agribusiness is going to go after. And then you have a situation like what you have in India, which is a full-on civil war between the indigenous folks in the forest and the multinational companies who are attempting to grab their land. So there are real sort of social situations and social problems that we need to address as a part of the narrative about what neoliberalism is doing in its quest for access to the commons, and its quest for raw materials, and its quest for labor. That's simply thinking about a kind of prefigurative space in which, again, really remarkable work is being done, cannot be the whole story of how we understand the circuits of capital accumulation and their consequences for people. And this, I think, leads to the fourth and last set of observations that I have that I think, and again, I say this as somebody who would happily fight alongside Raj on any number of protest things that we would, I think we probably have protested together at a number of things. I think that prefigurative politics are very, very dangerous because they present a kind of version of if only we all did X, we could solve the problem. And the problem here, it seems to me, is highly, highly systemic. It is a system problem of capitalism, that it is organized to do certain things. And it is not simply a solution of, kind of community reorganization or pockets of land and people outside of capitalism that can solve larger problems which are connected to what capitalism actually does. Those people in the video are really good examples of this. This is not sort of a kind of, Aboriginal community free from capitalism that you're seeing. They all are wearing clothes that are produced in sweatshops, most likely because they are poor and that's what they can afford. Living in houses that have some kind of, industrial materials that are in them. The solutions to whatever we think of about poverty will require a kind of systemic challenge to capitalism. And while prefigurative politics are very useful in explaining what is wrong with what capitalism is doing and why some kinds of private interventions into poverty reduction schemes are wrong, I think there's a real danger in using prefigurative politics as a kind of solution that we can hope for will spread and challenge capitalism organically. I think the challenge to capitalism is a thing that we also have to organize alongside supporting these sorts of community organizing efforts. And this brings me, I think, to the last problem, which is Raj's solution presupposes that people have at least access to one resource, and that is land. And it presupposes that people have the ability to use that land for their own purposes and to farm and deploy that land for the interests that they so choose. Land tenure is a very serious problem for the overwhelming majority of people who are not just food poor, but also land poor in the world today. And so even if we can imagine a situation in which 200,000 members of Via Campesina are able to have access to some plots of land and engage in some kind of subsistence agriculture which allows them to feed themselves. That is not the case for the overwhelming majority of poor that exists in the world. Some, depending on how we calculate it, 2 to 3.5 billion people in the world who don't have access to land, don't have access to formal employment, and certainly don't have access to social services that would allow them to survive their landlessness and food poverty. So I think that what's excellent about this paper is it forced me anyway to think through some of the ways that I had been kind of glib about what counts as a poverty reduction scheme to get behind or be supportive of. It definitely puts into context what is wrong with a number of the NGO-led strategies for NGO, and I guess in this case it's government-led because it's the G8 that's doing it, so it's not even really NGO. In that context, but it doesn't really sort of solve the problem of how we end poverty fully and how we sort of engage the question of food insecurity for everybody. What it does is, I think, begin a conversation about how we think through critically the discourses, the rationales, and the kind of ideologies under which we are allowed to feel good that poverty reduction or hunger reduction is happening. But in terms of a full program for what we do to end food insecurity for everybody, I think a much more global conversation has to happen about how capitalism and what it does, not just to produce poverty by creating massive unemployment, not just to what it does to housing and land access by making so many people landless and without access to any assets, but what it also does to food in general, and why when food is produced for a profit and not for consumption, the only consequence of that is going to be massive hunger and poverty all across the world. And I guess that may be a good place to end, or, yeah, okay.
Yeah, sure. Okay, great. Well, Snehal, what's wonderful is that I can respond to all of this by saying, yes, you're right. Well, because this is one chapter in a book with chapters on land reform and anti-capitalist activity, and so what's interesting about this is you're right, Snehal, that this is an example of an area where people do have land, and in fact, that to me is the critique here is that at some level this is challenging patriarchy, but not. I mean, this is still a feudal economy, and so what's interesting is that it flourishes under the sort of benevolent eye of a village headman. So am I then saying that really what we need to do is get back to, what we need is just benign dictators? Well, no. I mean, I think the interpretation I prefer, though you needn't give it to me, is that what you have here is, first of all, again, the sort of peer-to-peer organized, just people understanding that they are more powerful and they're able to be more politically and technically savvy than they have ever been allowed to be. And I think that I would submit to you all that sort of power of critical reflection when it comes to either modifying the external world in terms of, figuring out how to grow more from your land without relying on Monsanto, or figuring out how to actually get men to cook. These are techniques and skills that we have had taken away from us because these are all technical problems in the world of food security. But I do think that, I mean, the one issue where I push back a little bit is this isn't about productive labor. This is about reproductive labor. This is about getting men to cook. In the same way, I mean, in the US, we might go for Silvia Federici's idea of paid housework, which I think is a great idea. Here, of course, there's no currency to pay housework, and instead, the issue is absolutely around women's. I mean, often when I do the sort of Q&A, not Q&A, the sort of participatory action bit, where I say, well, you've got these problems of lots of people, you've got lots of food and not enough, and still there's pediatric malnutrition. How do you solve it? And people eventually get to breastfeeding, and then so how do you solve this problem of what do you do to end child malnutrition when you understand that the problem is that women have to breastfeed? And some people will say, well, get men to harvest. Why don't we get the men to harvest? Because then surely that would be fine. But in fact, women were very keen to maintain control over the harvest, because actually that ends up being a sort of site of struggle. And what they want is men to cook. And getting men to engage in reproductive labor, it seems to me, is a global struggle. I would submit. I mean, I'm the one who does the dishes, but I'm just saying this idea of men's reproductive work and actually equality in the household is a struggle that is just as important in the United States as it is elsewhere. I mean, obviously, I don't have to tell this room about the sort of wage disparities, but I also don't have to tell this room about the disparities in terms of productive versus reproductive labor. And it seems to me that there's if we're interested in subverting capitalism, one of the most interesting sort of potent parts of this is the challenge that capitalism can never sustain, which is the idea of recognizing the importance of reproductive labor and valuing reproductive labor. I mean, if capitalism were to value reproductive labor, it would fall apart. I mean, if there were, I mean, not a market in reproductive, but actually a full cost accounting of reproductive labor. And by reproductive labor, I'm using the sort of Marxist technical term of understanding not just the work of bearing children, but of sustaining communities, of doing all the the unpaid care work, the work of education, of everything from cooking, cleaning, fetching firewood to the work of building and sustaining, maintaining communities that is not paid for by capitalism, but which capitalism needs in order to be able to thrive. If we were to pay for that, if capitalism can't internalize that huge external cost. There are these movements to try and get capitalism to internalize its externalities. This is uninternalizable because it's part of the way that capitalism operates, is to externalize this core part of itself, the making and the sustaining of a working class. The production of that cannot be paid for by capitalism itself. So I think that there's something very interesting about that. But I'm with you. I think, in terms of prefigurative politics, I think that there is a role for prefigurative politics when it's followed up with the door-to-door organizing that's informed by not just, oh, isn't this awesome, but here's feminist organizing and here's how we're going to make it happen. I mean, I think there's a role for both. I think in order to get men interested and to be able to break through the cultural taboos around cooking that we saw there, you needed something fun. I mean, it's one thing to come with one's newspaper, for example, and say, comrades, I'm just out of the blue, but just make comrades. This is the road to emancipation. People are like, oh, that's fucking great, yeah, oh, really, and the solution is worker struggle, and the solution is worker struggle. But there's another way of doing that, which is kind of fun. And this is the joy of doing food stuff, right? Where you get to say, look, here's some great food. Here's everyone come around the pot. This is awesome. Everyone have a good time. And then the solution is work and struggle. And we're like, oh yeah, I could go for that. I mean, it's just more fun to have these moments of prefigurative politics followed by the hard Yeah, I mean, there was nothing sort of, hey, everyone having fun in this moment of feminist confrontation, you know, where you saw everyone sitting around having that awkward moment, and when you saw Anita kicking ass and taking names, you know, sort of whipping out the Bible when she needed to, and just using, she was a great organizer right there, and it was uncomfortable. That wasn't fun. That was straight politics, and it was tough feminist organizing, and it was hard, and. In almost every other case that we've seen, that gets the job done. In fact, Winston is a bit of an outlier in this. But it seems to me that there is a role for joyful moments followed by tough, you know, and informed politics around the role, you know, the way that capitalism needs to be overthrown. So I'm with you on that, and I definitely think that issues around access to land, which is in the next chapter of the book, and if you ever have me back, I promise to talk more about land access. There's some really interesting stuff happening around that. I do think that access to the means of production is important. I think that just the story here is just interesting because it's, you know, it takes, I mean, in the way that it topples the idea of, you know, the genius who's going to solve this, and instead distributes the sensibility and the intelligence of a community away from, dude, I'm going to put vitamins in this and you'll be fine, to a much more kind of, look, what we need is, you know, we need time to breastfeed. How do we get time to breastfeed? Well, we need men to do the cooking, and how do we do that? We have to confront patriarchy, and how do we do that? We have, you know, that's just a much tougher way, but it brings results much quicker than adding vitamins to things. So anyway, that's what I submit that basically I agree with you. So thanks. But should we take questions maybe in groups of 3 so that I can write down things that you say?
And just start with these 2 tables.
I'm sorry, yes, and these 2 tables.
Actually, Sally, Chuck, and Ben.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm Sonia. I'm in class.
Hi, sorry.
I'm really interested in U.S. food policy, and so one thing that I had trouble with your reading was I was thinking in my head like, well, how does this affect my interpretation of U.S. food policy? And so here, you know, people are getting a lot of caloric intake, but that still doesn't do anything for their nutrition. So I think in the U.S. nutrition promotion is a bigger priority than hunger reduction. And so in the U.S., even if we had gender equality in the household and we had men cooking, I think that we would still need private participation. Because, for example, you could have a man who cooks, but if he can't buy, you know, nutritious foods, then what does it matter?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So who's next? Yeah.
My name's Chuck. I'm also in the class.
Sure.
I was wondering, do you think there's any lessons or techniques we can draw out of these collaborative programs like recipe days that we can apply successfully to combat hunger in urban contexts?
Great question. And there was the third question, yeah.
I was just wondering, inside of Africa, has there been any communities that either said no to foreign investment or really focused on just African investment that has thrived with the public-private?
That's very interesting. In terms of saying no to foreign investment, I don't know of any community that's kind of said no explicitly to international investment, because in general the circumstances under which a country would be able to say that tend to be rare, right? I mean, the reason that Malawi, for example, signed up to this accord was, it wasn't random. It happened because Malawi was being pushed towards a debt crisis, not of its own making, but because the IMF had devalued. And so all of a sudden, Malawi needed foreign capital in a hurry. And at the same moment as the IMF took things away, the government was said, and it was ushered towards. But we know that you just balanced your budget, and now it's imbalanced because you had to devalue your currency, and you're hemorrhaging dollars. Luckily, we have some buddies over here, some Norwegians who have quite a lot of dollars who they want to give you if you sign up to this partnership. So bear in mind that the history of African countries being able to make free choices on the international arena is pretty, it's pretty narrow. I mean, there have been examples where, for example, Zambia has said no to genetically modified crops because very reasonably they didn't have a biosafety protocol in place to be able to admit or not admit things. So to that extent, you've been able to see stuff. But it's also important to know, I mean, in that graph back there was a little blip where South Africa, for example, was busy investing in things. And there have been communities who've said no to South African capital because, again, in Zambia, the Zambians burned down a South African supermarket because of the way that chain was treating local suppliers. So, I mean, there have been examples where communities have said, well, bugger that, we're not, aimed at a specific kind of intervention or a specific sort of force of capital. But in terms of the general, no, we are going to do it all by ourselves, I don't think that there's been given that sort of autonomy or that kind of space or that kind of freedom to be able to say that. I mean, to be able to say that would take a fight. And the only example I really know of something approaching that was at the World Trade Organization in 1999, where and I just so happened to be on the Zimbabwean delegation on the inside as well as protesting on the outside. I was shuttling backwards and forwards, so I could see both sides. It was very interesting, and what I saw was that initially the African delegation were just being treated incredibly badly by the U.S. hosts. They would have their little meeting room, and the U.S. hosts would be like, "You out," because they needed it for Cargill to caucus or something, that, combined with the sort of outrage that was coming from the streets, allowed the Africa Caucus to say no to the World Trade Organization draft in 1999, which was kind of unheard of. It was a very rare moment in history, but it was possible. So that kind of thing has happened, and one hopes that it may continue. But in general, I'm not. I don't think. I'm not aware of sort of specific communities constituting. Does anyone know of anything like that? 'Cause, nothing immediately jumps to mind. Yeah.
I'm thinking about the Community Alliance for Global Justice and their work with African farmers to keep an eye on building litigation.
Well, I mean, yes. So there was. Thank you so much. There was a terrific conference up in Seattle a few weeks ago now, where there was kind of a Bill and Melinda Gates watch, and African farmers are kind of watching where this unaccountable money goes. Because who's going to watch, right? Who's watching the largest private foundation in the world? Well, the second largest, the IKEA Foundation apparently is the largest foundation in the world, but its sole beneficiary is the guy who set it up. So the second largest, so the Bill and Melinda, I mean, you'll see them, floating around in clouds of smug. But they're offering, that we're here to fight hunger, we're here to fight poverty, and farmers are organised to be able to fight back against that. But I'm not sure the extent to which they have the force as nations, for example, to be able to say no, bugger off. But keeping an eye on it is a very good idea. Now, in terms of urban policy, that's a really interesting question. You raised that too. I mean, I've done some, in fact, work in slums in South Africa with the Abahlali Basem Jondola's fantastic shack dweller movement, based out of Durban, but spreading throughout South Africa now, also active in Cape Town and a few other places. And what's interesting about them is that they have they have ideas about the world without slums that they want to live in, and they're very keen still, and this may be a generational issue, to be able to have a vibrant rural economy. Because they're not very happy about living in slums. The reason they're very clear about the reason that they live in slums is precisely the kinds of trajectory that Snehal was talking about, where we had my father, my grandfather, my grandmother, my mother was able to farm, and then we were able no more, and so then we had to come to the city because of these improving technologies, or because the local landowner just kicked us off our land so that they could grow row crops and monoculture. And what we need is a return to polyculture, which I think is part of what this is about. But so what shack dwellers are keen on doing is a sort of two-stage process. One, actually being able to occupy land to be able to grow food. So some of the settlements do have food growing there. But much more, what they want is a rural policy that lets them get the hell out of the city and get back to a rural area that has investment in things like hospitals and good schools and good paying jobs and light industry and the kind of quality of life that they came to the city for in the first place. But it seems to me that that is something that has to be fought for, because what you have overwhelmingly in development policy these days is urban bias. I mean, I was telling the story of NAFTA to people who don't know. I mean, you're familiar with NAFTA, right? So maybe you may be less familiar with how agriculture got into NAFTA. Because agriculture, I mean, when the US and Canada were negotiating with Mexico, they were like, well, obviously, we're going to send our steel to you in Mexico. And Mexico, obviously, yes, you are. And obviously, we're going to send our electronics. And obviously, yes, you are. And then the Mexican government said, well, we need to put agriculture on the table. And the US said, well, obviously, we're not going to stop subsidizing our farmers, and that's going to destroy your rural economy. And the Mexican government said, well, not destroy, but help our peasants move out of being the peasantry into being modern workers. They had an idea that the peasantry were hopelessly backward, and what they needed to be doing was moving to the cities and getting jobs so that they could be part of the working, part of the proletariat. Obviously. And obviously it happened, and obviously that's exactly the kinds of outcome that the Mexican government wanted came to pass, where farming became an unsustainable activity, and then people moved to urban areas to be able to get jobs that stayed there for as long as it took capital to work out that they could be getting those jobs done much more cheaply in China. And so you had the hop of people from rural to urban to unemployment happening, within the course of 10 years. Now, I think that's it's really interesting to notice that urban bias in even coming from Mexico. Again, when you hear the story of NAFTA, it's like evil U.S. corporations, good Mexico. But no, it's in fact a sort of a class collaboration, a very interesting one. That is about destroying the peasantry and reconfiguring it in interesting ways. But I think when we're interested in thinking about urban food policy, and particularly we're thinking about the United States, then the thing to worry about is poverty. I mean, this isn't just about about Malawi. 50 million Americans are food insecure. That's a poverty problem. That's not a kind of, we need better labeling problem. It's a poverty problem. And it seems to me that the way you fight that is through are people familiar with Thomas Piketty, the author of Capital in the 21st Century? A global maximum wage and a global minimum wage seem to me like good ideas. And a living wage in the United States is a tremendously good idea. Now, the way we get to a living wage is not by wishing for it, but by organizing. And that's not the sort of thing that you see on the side of a package, right? I mean, and if you're interested in good, nutritious food in the United States, then it may come as a shock to realize that but how much are food stamps per meal? Do you know? Maybe $1.60 if you've got the wind behind you. That's not enough to be able to get good, nutritious food. So it doesn't matter who's doing the cooking. If you're living on food on SNAP for Food in Time with a supplementary nutritional assistance program, that's just. That's a poverty issue. So it seems to me that actually tackling poverty is important. And if we're interested in tackling poverty, sure, I'm happy to have private participation. If the private sector is going to bring in $20 an hour minimum wage, then that's great. That's the kind of private participation I want to see. But I don't think it'll happen by asking the private sector to do that. We're seeing plenty of opportunities where the private sector could pay $20 an hour, and they don't seem to be keen on it. So it seems to me that the answer there is, again, to set aside the private sector and recognize that the right to food is more important, even here in the United States. Now, yes, nutritional labeling, that's great. I actually think that there's a country that's way ahead of the United States. Most countries are ahead of the United States, but the country that's really excitingly ahead of us on this is Brazil. Brazil just announced its dietary guidelines, and we have someone represented from Brazil. So Brazil has just published its dietary guidelines, and the number one dietary guideline in Brazil is not make sure you consume your RDA of vitamin A and B and C and D and there's none of that. Instead, the number one sort of recommendation is cook your meals at home if you can. And the number 10 recommendation is don't believe what fast food companies tell you. There's a provision in the national guidelines not to believe what you are told on television. Now, that's important because and they want to push that forward a little bit. There's an agency that is tasked with the rights of children in Brazil. And one of their recommendations is to ban all advertising, not just of food, but everything to children. Now, that's a food issue, because how is it, do you think, that we form the kind of crappy tastes for what passes for food in this country? It doesn't happen by magic. I mean, it happens through that, we see the salt, fat, sugar sort of high chemistry and sorcery of the food industry at work, but marketing has a lot to do with it. So our desires for food are not just innate things. I caused trouble the other day by saying that, for example, the desire for meat wasn't a natural ingrained thing, but it was marketed to us. And people are like, no, everyone wants to eat meat. It's a natural part of being human being. And of course, this is a room full of Americans. If I said this to a room full of Jains, for example, or a room full of Hindus, everyone would be like, yeah, obviously. but I mean, it's very interesting that the way we desire things is something that capitalism has sold us, right? I mean, the reason that the U.S. diet is so bad is not an accident; it is a profitable diet. And sure, we can put little indications of what it is that's good and bad, but surely it'd be better not to introduce those things in the first place, particularly to children who have, as we know, reduced capacities for reason, and that's why we don't let children carry guns. Not even in Texas do we allow that. Or do we? Do we? Really? It's like 6-year-olds with guns? Oh, good God. All right, I'll have to change that part of the... Oh, Mary, mother. Anyway, but we don't let them vote. So there we are. We don't let them vote in Texas unless they have the gun permit, right? There's no getting away from it. But point being, so the marketing, I think, is something that needs to be controlled, and that seems to me that's a lesson to learn. And again, what you saw here in the recipe day was a sort of way of transforming desire. I mean, here are things like cowpea and millet, and historically people have eaten that, but they discover that by deep frying things, it tastes way better. And by coming up with new recipes for these foods, they can make eating healthy a fun thing to be doing. And figuring out those recipes and figuring out those new skills, I think that's an important part of what this teaches us as well. But I also, I definitely think that fighting poverty is an important thing to do, and I think that's something we learn from here as well. So 3 more questions? Yes. 1, 2, and 3. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. Here with some of my students, we're doing a class now on the geographies of globalization. So I just wanted you to speak a little bit to GMOs and this new alliance and how that's bound up with patent law, if it is at all.
Okay, great. Who's next?
Thank you very much. My question was, I wanted to hear a little bit more about the Hunger Summit. Particularly, it seemed like it was a choice to go with the business investment side rather than more peer-to-peer network side. And I'm wondering, what stake the leaders of the Hunger Summit have in going with that, or what led into that choice.
Okay, great. And there was, yes, sir.
So I was wondering about the role of sort of private enterprise and the state in your model. Because I think if we listen to Snehal, you would say, take private enterprise out of food production.
Altogether.
That suggests the state, right? Taking the most.
No, we could do it
active
this
role.
way too. We could do peer-to-peer control over the
And
land.
in your model, it sounds more like you're just kind of locating private enterprise down a little bit, giving more local control. Individuals still have some role in producing their own stuff and doing and deciding and so on. But then you leaven it with some, cooperative ventures, maybe in collectively creating a brain bank or something. I don't know. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about sort of the economic model that's behind your idea.
Great. So yeah, patent law. It's certainly clear that what the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are keen on is the best varieties available for monoculture, and I think that's one of the stories here is that the kind of model, the kind of thinking that's driving this kind of new agriculture forward is a celebration, an uncritical celebration of monoculture, because monoculture, you just plant one crop and you plant row upon row upon row upon row of this one crop, and the idea of turning the fields into factories where you just plant one of something is, again, historically, it's been successful when there's been all the other sort of accoutrements of modern agriculture. So when there are markets for the one crop, and when all people want are the one crop, and where there are people prepared to pay for just the one crop in a global kind of system of markets. But the global system of food markets, for example, the global food market's pretty young. I mean, the first global food market is, 150 years old. That's a global market in wheat. And in order to be constructed, the global market in wheat required the colonization of India, colonization of China. Well, not the colonization, but the annexing of China and the forcing of China to consume opium in exchange for tea. This is something from that you can read in Mike Davis's absolutely required reading, Late Victorian Holocausts. It's a brilliant book. And what it talks about is the spread of the global free market, and where, in order for the global free market to look the way that it looks, 30 million people needed to die, not because there was a shortage of food, but because the new rules of exchange were required, so that you had workers who were loading the food onto trains that would be sent to Calcutta, that would be sent to Britain, so that the workers in Europe could have cheap wheat. And those workers in India who were growing the wheat, surrounded by wheat, died because their wages were too low to be able to buy food. Which helps bring that idea of monoculture is one that I think our leaders are keen on, and they're very keen on whoever it is that can promise new improvements. So Jeffrey Sachs, Jeffrey Sachs, a very dangerous man, and now bitter, thank God. After his years of proselytizing Jeffrey Sachsism, he now thinks that the only thing that's going to change the world is social movements, which I'm very pleased about. But he once offered that, well, what if there's a gene for climate change? What if genetically modified crops can save the world in terms of climate change? And again, the infrastructure for this kind of these kinds of crops is being created by creating the agro dealership network, by eviscerating the private sector, the public research in seeds, by getting rid of scientists, publicly funded scientists who could do agroecology, and instead having the kinds of concentration of knowledge in the private sector where there are just you tweak the seed, you patent it, which is covered by WTO law in any case, and then you make that available. I don't think that there's specifically sort of GMO technology being pushed forward as part of the Accords, but it's certainly the case that Monsanto is doing very well out of the agro-dealer network, and it's certainly true that the system of global monoculture is doing very well. When the largest single funder is a fertilizer company, that to me is a problem. And this isn't to say that African soils don't need amendment in a one-off sort of process, but to get African agriculture hooked on the system of permanent renewal of soil and evisceration of soil chemistry and biology through the addition of inorganic fertilizer, that's a problem. So I think that rather than worrying about GMOs, which are already locked into place by WTO agreements on intellectual property, the bigger worry is about monoculture, and I suppose the biggest worry is the opportunity cost. Right? The opportunity cost of going down this route of row crops and row crops and row crops is a different way of farming where you can get more out of the soil and you have more nutritious food available and you have a range of other alternatives. But those alternatives aren't on policymakers' mind. They never get to hear about them, and I think, to be honest, assuming that policymakers aren't bastards, which sometimes is a fair assumption to make, I think that here they're going for the biggest return on their dollar. And that's a problem because when one thinks of the big leaps forward in terms of fighting of human rights, although there may have been a dollar tag attached to it, the dollar tag didn't come first, and then the human rights second. It's always, this needs to be done as a human rights priority, and yes, we will pay for it. But for example, someone was saying, like, if we'd actually had the bill up front for something like Medicare or Medicaid, would it have happened? If we'd had a legion of health economists giving us the numbers about, well, it'll cost this much to do this much dialysis in the United States. What we have socialized care in the United States for kidneys, for example. One organ's medicine has been socialized in the United States. And if we had all the data for doing that and all the numbers and all the dollar value for doing that, would we have done it? And the chances are we probably wouldn't, because the price tag associated with some of the healthcare interventions in the United States are ridiculous. But we made the choice because it was the right thing to do. And it seems to me that policymakers are trapped in this kind of ass-backwards world of letting the choice of what is right and what is not be dictated by what is affordable and what isn't, rather than the other way around. And so it seems to me that when, insofar as policymakers are choosing, they're choosing between very limited parameters, because they have an eye not on the just, but on the affordable. And that seems to me to lead us down the avenues in the United States where the word affordable appears. And you can imagine what those are. But I think that in terms of justice, in terms of what the policymakers are looking at, they're not being presented with, first of all, the affordability of something like agroecology and food sovereignty. But they're also not being, they're thinking within very limited kind of parameters, and this seems to offer a lot of bang for the buck, even though my money, and I will take anyone's bet, that the number of people lifted out of poverty here will be far different from something like a food, seeds, and soils, food, and healthy communities initiative. And insofar as this does succeed, it'll happen much more through a rejigging of numbers rather than through actual poverty being ended. So to get to the economic system then, I mean, it seems to me that when we're talking about an economic system that's premised on, and you can see where I'm going, and you're unhappy about it, and I'm sorry about that, but I mean, you can see that an international sort of agricultural system that depends on making food available to the highest bidder, it seems to me runs afoul of the right to food. So how do we address that? Well, certainly we have to make some basic commitments around making sure that people's right to food trumps the right to property. At some level, either we make that choice or we don't, right? I mean, either we let people go hungry or we do not. If we make the choice that we don't want anyone to go hungry, then it seems to me the right to property does need at some point to be subsumed to other kinds of rights. And it's a good question to ask, well, what are those rights? I mean, I'm very keen on the idea, because I'm a bit more suspicious of the state than Snehal is, or maybe not. No, okay, we're equally suspicious of the state. Then it seems to me that the kind of widespread, worker and community control of food, that actually the community here has its own seed bank and its own grain store because it doesn't trust the government, and the government actually has been very unreliable in providing all those things. But I mean, I think that there are communities. I mean, the creation of buffers and of community seed banks and of community grain banks where exchange happens, and where I think that free exchange between uncoerced individuals is terrific. And it's just that the system we live in at the moment is the opposite of that. Capitalism is the anti kind of exchange, where people are coerced all the time. I think free exchange where people own the means of production is a terrific idea. Now, whether that happens under cooperatives or whether that happens under the village level, I think that's up for people to decide themselves and to fight for themselves. But I certainly think the cooperatives are a terrific way to go. But I think that people having the sovereign right to be able to decide when to violate the right to property in order to make sure that everyone gets fed, and making sure that the right to food is the one that gets respected rather than property is the way to go. Yes, 1, 2, and 1, 2. Okay, good.
This is great. I usually have to call on myself.
Okay,
Since you're doing it. So that was worth the wait. Thank you, Raj.
You're welcome.
I have 2 questions.
Yes.
Since there was only one other hand. So one is maybe to ask about your conception of human rights. And I know, I mean, this is the first talk and paper that didn't, I mean, you did talk about human rights, but not in the paper. And that was one of the things that was interesting, actually, for us to think about social justice movements outside of human rights. And so I guess I just want to say human rights and neoliberalism actually go quite well together. So often human rights are a way to mop up the excesses of neoliberalism. And I think that the right to food, the right to water, the right to adequate standard of living, or the right to health, can all play that role if we don't also further theorize what we mean by the rights. And so, I mean, part of this is even maybe just differing a little bit with the historical account that we used to have a right to food and then neoliberalism replaced it. But I think that there's important work to be done, so I'd love to hear you think through that. And the second question I have is, I'm wondering about how you think the gender inequality that you show in the film and talk about in the paper, where's that, what's the construction of that? And I was already thinking about that question, but then in Snehal's comment about what happened in Bangladesh, right? So looking at the interplay of different forms of gender equality, because I worry a little bit that it's presented as sort of natural African gender inequality. And I kind of giggled along with a lot of it too, but I'm not sure, there's something about that representation of it, I guess, that bothers me a bit, because I suspect that if we went a little bit deeper, we can imagine that the origins of it are not unrelated to access to land, food.
And why they fight to do all the harvesting.
Right.
My question had something to do with that, that is reluctant to apply the gender equality, could you think about other ways to apply the model without like preparing food together as a main component? So, like, what happens if a community says no, 90% of the community says that, yeah, the guys will not cook? Can you still apply the model?
That's very so. What this model was about was trying to figure out ways where to stop men doing those kinds of interventions with their buddies, right? Where you have stories of, you saw Winston saying, well, what about, won't my friends see me and think that I'm under her petticoat government? One of the things about the recipe day that's very different from an individual kind of administering of like go around, teach people to cook and move on, is that it presents a kind of a different kind of normal and makes it possible for there publicly to be a different kind of normal where men get to cook. And those men pounding soybeans are doing, some of them are doing it for the first time, some of them are very practiced. But seeing it and for it to be okay, for everyone to recognize and to be open about a conversation where no one has had witchcraft cast upon them, where there is no sort of petticoat government being offered because people are going into this freely. That experience of seeing that stuff happening and for it to be normal is part of what the program is about. So initially where there's a moment of where this thing happens for the first time in a community, the men who are not part of it are looking on aghast, just as Winston was. And there are always men sitting around the side, but the men who get in the middle and do it are not being prevented by the men at the side, which is often what would happen for the first time if this were happening as a sort of solo effort. So in part, this is the sort of outcome of many iterations of the attempt to try this out in new and different communities. I'm not sure what would happen if the community sort of rallied round and said, no, we prefer things just the way they are. But I will ask the next time I'm there. But I don't think that it's happened, because in general, to be part of this, one also has to have been part of the farmer research team, where you learn some of the skills about anyone who is around the table can talk. And that already is quite a stretch for some of the men who are not used to being around a table where women are often the better seed savers and farming experts. But that's, having seen ample evidence of that, there seems to be much more openness to that. Now it's interesting then, I guess, when I see this, I see something that's immediately relevant to the United States. And I guess maybe I look at it and I see the kinds of patriarchy that are alive and well here, and maybe I'm just missing how unusual and strange it is, because it seems to me that there are, in terms of, what's weird and African about it?
Well, that was the question.
Well, I'm saying nothing. I guess my in terms of engaging with, it seems to me that there's something very universal about the reluctance of men to get involved in reproductive labor, and about the need to overcome that, and how feminism and feminist organizing can help with that. But maybe I'm clearly having a brain fart moment here, because I'm failing to engage with that part of the question. And since Snehal also said, I really want to understand it.
Well, part of this could be a rural-urban divide also, but it could also just be, I'm not sure, maybe people aren't doing that kind of feminist organizing in the United States, we could say. But I guess it's more than that, because I think there are particular ways in which gender inequality is structured in the various places you're looking at it. So maybe, in fact, I'm sort of resisting the universalizing sort of idea about patriarchy that suggests, even though you're showing particular ways in which it's operating, so whether, it's interesting, because I did see it as sort of a presentation of something particular, or people or was hearing a reaction to it in a way that made it seem quaint or different.
Oh, that's interesting.
But I also, even in reading the paper, I thought if the whole thing is to go in and respond to gender inequality, I thought actually don't we need to acknowledge the extent to which the gender inequality itself might be constructed, and from the global north
Yes. Oh, I see what you mean. Okay. Yeah. And that's right. I mean, I think if I mean the language being used there was tumbuka, but if you heard that there was a word that popped, and that's gender, Genda, which is the tumbuka word for gender. And it's obviously a word import. It's obviously borrowed language. And it's it's circulated through the NGO world, and it's come to mean a whole bunch of different things, right? Doing gender is what some people will call, that sort of performance of going to a gender workshop, not doing gender in the Judith Butler sense, but doing gender as in you've gone to a gender workshop, now you know how to do gender. And I think that's a very interesting kind of.
But actually, sorry, I was talking about the inequality being structured, gender inequality being structured from the global north, not the response, right? So the way in which it's.
Oh, and in that case, yes. I mean the idea. I mean, Caliban and the Witch is a really interesting book. If people familiar with Caliban and the Witch, Silvio Federici's really, really interesting and magisterial account of how colonialization actually helps to structure gender roles in the global South. And so witchcraft is this thing that becomes a way in which women are dispossessed and become oppressed in new ways under capitalism. Whenever you see just a quick flag. Whenever you hear about accusations of witchcraft being leveled in Africa, which occasionally those things will appear in U.S. newspapers, this many women executed for witchcraft. Usually, those were women who were standing up for their rights, or were on land that the local village headman wanted, and they ended up being accused of witchcraft and then dispossessed of property. So I certainly think that the ideas that circulate around witchcraft, for instance, are ones that gain currency when title to property becomes very important. And there's a long history of that. But what's interesting here is not that this is a pre-capitalist community, but it's just that there's been, the sort of tentacles of capitalism haven't, the word penetration is just not the right word, but it's not the, there's this literature of capitalism having reached and transformed places. And of course, everywhere has been reached and transformed by modern capital. But what's happened here, it seems to me, has been structured by experiences of colonialism, experiences of the state, and of who it is that is allowed to know things. And I think that maybe that's a nice way of answering this, is that what this is in a sense a response to the way that the Malawian state has controlled agricultural knowledge and invested its sort of source in men who know how to plant things. And in a sense that inequality has already been made itself present in the fields. But I think this is a conversation we need to have that's going to last a long time. But I also want to just finally to end on rights and neoliberalism. I think the idea of rights by themselves, there's the idea of talk of rights without being able to implement them is nonsense on stilts, right? And what's interesting is the idea here of people fighting for a right to have rights, the ability to be able to make claims on other sovereign agencies where they have those rights delivered, and whether those agencies are a community or their local sort of village governing body. I think those are all important. So I certainly see that rights can be used to mop up after neoliberalism. But the latest interpretation of the right to food isn't about just making sure that people have enough to eat and then has enough vitamins and then they're happy. But it's much more about food sovereignty. It's about an idea of communities being able to democratically control their access to food. And if the special rapporteur on the right to food did nothing else, he did a great job in broadening the right to food beyond just making sure that there were plates full and that they would be respected and monitored and restored and all the rest of that. But much more in terms of community control over making sure that the food gets to the way that the food gets to a plate. And that idea of the right to food and that interpretation of the right to food isn't compatible with neoliberalism because it involves democracy, and democracy and neoliberalism couldn't be less compatible. And maybe that's the place to end. Thanks very much.